So while we're waiting for people to come and ask their question, I guess I thought I would start. And I wanted to thank everybody for your great talks. It's really a pleasure to see this level of science being brought to such an important topic. But I was thinking maybe from each of your perspectives, how do you imagine applying the kind of science to community outreach that we're thinking about with Trauma-Free NYC, and how could we go about either through education or through intervention, bringing this to some sort of next level? And I direct that to all three of the speakers.
Sure. So I think some of the work that I talked about pretty directly aims to bring what we've learned to the community. But certainly partnerships, I think, are really important. And so Trauma-Free NYC is a great example of that initiative to really connect people. And connections to child welfare system, for example, is really important. So Power of Two that I talked about is working with ACS to really get this into the homes of children that need it the most. And there's a lot of community partners that I think we can collaborate with to really bring this science into homes.
Yeah, I would say we have to think about intervention efforts and then also education efforts, right? So there are intervention efforts that we can focus on parenting or on poverty and risk reduction. And then there's also education efforts to make it be known to the broader community that exposure to adversity leads to elevation in risk for a number of outcomes, including behavior outcomes and achievement outcomes that aren't necessarily the children's fault. And so by sort of broadening our effort to educate teachers and school districts and the legal system, potentially could go further than any one intervention in changing public perception of these issues.
Yeah, I think, similar to what Kim said, I think that one of the things that I'm excited about for Trauma-Free NYC is that we keep a heavy research arm involved, and the knowledge is so important in terms of where to focus efforts. And I think that identification of sensitive periods of brain development are really important to know about, because it really kind of narrows the focus on where do we want to place the largest investments, and to know that parents are so powerful to empower parents to think about how they're influencing future outcomes is really critical. And if we're going to care about parents, then we need to think about how are we supporting families as a whole. So if we're going to care about child development, what are the strategies that we need to come up with as a community to provide support for families?
Thank you. And again, we have a microphone back here. I can continue to ask questions because I found this endlessly fascinating. And one of the things that, so just if people could line up behind Jackie.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Have you thought about doing these presentations for people who work at the Administration of Children's Services in New York City? Are you doing that? Or do you plan to?
Yeah, so Trauma-Free NYC is building up a partnership with ACS to try and use neuroscientific approaches to better understand how to help children and families.
I also think the comment about being non-judgmental and non-critical when you're dealing with parents is very important. I am a social worker and had worked with the Agency for Children's Services, and also before that the Bureau of Child Welfare, and then a social worker in the school system. And all of that's another place where you could do presentations. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's very good talk. Thank you.
Hi. I am a psychologist. I am from Mexico, and we have studied this phenomenon for many, many years, of course. And I am interested in the experiment that you are going to give money to the families. So how are these families are going to be selected?
Mm-hmm.
What would be the requirements, because how do we know that this money is going to be well spent on children and on other things?
Sure. So the question is, how will the families be selected for the clinical trial of poverty reduction, and how do we know that they will spend their money wisely? So in terms of the first question, we have pretty broad inclusion. So to provide informed consent, moms have to be 18 years of age. They have to speak English or Spanish, because those are the languages our interviewers speak and the languages of our assessments. They need to live in the states where we're conducting the research, and that's because if we were to give mothers money, that cash influx might render them ineligible for other social services like Medicaid or food stamps. And so we've secured waivers in the locations where we're conducting the research to ensure that that won't happen. And then they need to have lived below the poverty line for the last calendar year. Otherwise, we're pretty agnostic. So we don't care, how many, essentially, we don't care how many children are in the home in terms of inclusion. We are not screening out based on things like drug use or what have you. That's part of some of the things that we're measuring, but we're not hanging inclusion or exclusionary criteria on those types of characteristics. Similarly, the cash itself is unconditional, and we could talk about the rationale for that. But although we are administering the cash via debit card, so we are able to track the transactions, we're not requiring that mothers spend it in any particular way. Social science evidence suggests that low-income families, when faced with a cash influx, actually spend it in much the same way as higher-income families. And so although we hear that question a lot, the evidence doesn't actually bear it out that lower-income families are more likely to indulge in adult vices, for example. And we conducted a pilot study in my lab here in New York back in 2014 with 30 moms, and found that over the course of 1 year, there were a little over 1,100 transactions, debit card transactions in that pilot sample, of which exactly 3 took place in a liquor store. So our pilot study bore that out, that it doesn't seem to be the case that low-income moms, squander the money. And in contrast, their interviews with us and the debit card expenditures suggest that they tend to use the money to support their families.
Good luck with your research.
Hi, I work for ACS, so I appreciate the commentary. And while I would say that there is a lot of conversations and movement happening around neuroscience and thinking about early childhood, I'm wondering what have you folks been doing or others been doing around addressing parental trauma? So the children we're talking about are stuck in cycles of intergenerational trauma, and if we're not addressing the trauma that their parents have faced, how are we, how do we expect to break that full cycle? And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I'll answer from the basic neuroscience literature that's out there, and then I'm thinking that Kristen is going to be able to address this through her work. But certainly it's been shown now that traumas don't just stay in the individual, as you're pointing out, but they get carried forward through generations. So for example, again, using rodent models, people aren't rodents, but there are some basic questions that we can answer. It's been shown that early adversity in generation 1 can actually show up behaviorally in generation 3, right? So that's a challenging message to hear. However, interventions that occur at generation 1, ameliorative influences, also get transferred across time. So I think it goes back to the point that it's really important to not just think about the child, but to think about the family, to think about the neighborhood, and to think about the historical context in which children are growing up. So,
yeah, I think there are a number of different approaches for trying to reduce the effects of early childhood adversity, and some of them focus more heavily on parents and trying to address issues related to mental health or trauma, and some of those involve pretty intensive long-term interventions. But But there's pretty good evidence to suggest that short-term interventions can also be really effective at disrupting some of those cycles over time. And I think that both approaches are really important to consider, especially because babies can't always wait for everything else to be fixed before they have a sensitive caregiver. And so if we can get in there and build up sensitive parenting really quickly as a protective factor, and then potentially or simultaneously through a different approach, target parents' own history of trauma, that could be really good, so that babies don't have to kind of wait till mom has it together before they have mom available.
You know, we're actively testing whether modest increases in material resources can affect maternal mental health and parenting style. So I think we're all sort of on the same boat that a two-generational approach is really critical.
Hi. So a lot of your research, all of your sort of talks were about sort of biological endpoints, or sort of maybe more sort of, neurodevelopment and biological outcomes. So I'm very curious about the sort of the clinical trial that's upcoming, or the dissemination of the ABC project. Is there opportunity or feasibility for sort of biosamples or biological endpoints, and so a lot of the research that you seem to be passionate about, to sort of see whether sort of the effect of these interventions actually translate to sort of biological change according to these mediators, or like childhood outcomes.
Sure. So in our clinical trial, we will be measuring stress physiology in both the parents and the children, so both salivary and hair cortisol in moms and kids. And then we'll be measuring children's brain function at age 3 using electrophysiological methods, EEG and ERP. The hope would be to follow them longer term to be able to do neuroimaging when they're a little bit older.
No blood or urine or any sample?
Not yet. We would love to. So far we've raised $15 million for the basic study, and then certainly our hope is to be able to expand upon that.
Thank you all for your presentations. I think while a lot of the brain chemistry information is new and really exciting in terms of being able to think about interventions, a lot of the sources of trauma and deprivation have been going on for a long time, and have been known, and yet policy changes in response to those factors seem never to come. And I'm wondering if any of your partnerships or planning have to do with somehow directly putting some energy into impacting policy decisions, I guess at every level where we have policies.
Yeah. So I just completed a paper that's directed towards policymakers to try and translate some of this information into practical suggestions. So I think all of us have probably done similar things like that, but at a more direct level, I think that's one of the things that we as a group at Trauma Free NYC are really invested in doing, is being able to take what's happening here at Columbia, for example, and translating that to folks that can actually do things at a grander scale. So that's our main hope, actually.
Yeah, and certainly the political climate varies, right, from year to year and across geographical locations. I can tell you that right now, City Hall is very interested in this kind of work with an eye toward policy implementation. So I think, regardless of what's happening at a national level, there are frequently local governmental administrations that are thinking very carefully about how to apply this work to policy.
And with the ABC intervention in particular and Power of Two's work, ACS is a huge partner there. And so a lot of the source of support and referrals are directly coming from foster care agencies and ACS. And this scaling up across New York City of the ABC intervention really shows a huge investment of the city into that initiative. And I think there's always challenges of sustainability and funding, and hopefully showing the effectiveness when interventions are kind of moved out, and being able to show that change could enhance the buy-in of key stakeholders that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the buy-in is really important, right? Because human development is very slow, and it's outpaced by election cycles. So you need to have faith that the investment is going to pay off, but it's not going to happen during your cycle.
It's very hopeful. Thank you.
I have a question about your partnership with members of the medical community, like physicians. I've heard a lot about school and parents, and obviously those are both really important levers as well, but I'm curious about the medical community. And then a second question I have is just regarding interventions with parents. I'm wondering, especially I guess for ABC, what sort of pushback, if any, you've received from parents who I imagine could view this as sort of like a judgment of their parenting skills, and how you handle that.
I'll start with the second question.
I'm happy to take this.
It's pretty. So I initially, when I started doing the intervention work and actually going into homes, was expecting to get a lot more resistance than I got. And I think part of it is because how this intervention in particular is designed to be very focused on the positive. So it becomes hard to be defensive when someone keeps telling you you're doing a good job. And so I think that positive support really helps break down some of that resistance initially. Although certainly the initial engagement in the intervention and wanting to enroll to begin with and have someone come into your home and videotape you, because we tape every session, can be threatening at first. And so I think those comments really help reduce that threat initially and build up a rapport with the parent coach and the parent. I think we've had more challenge working sometimes with foster parents who have a lot of experience sometimes in working with a lot of children and don't necessarily need the ABC intervention any less than parents who have lost their children into foster care, but sometimes feel like they have a lot more training and experience. But still, the positive commenting seems to break down that resistance pretty quickly.
And in terms of partnership with the medical community, I think that's a really excellent way to reach children, particularly in early childhood before they're enrolled in schools, right? I think more commonly are the types of parenting interventions that focus on home visitation, but as Kristen just mentioned, it can be difficult to enroll families and keep them enrolled. And whereas over 90% of kids have a regular pediatrician who they see with some frequency. There's 10 well child visits that are scheduled in the first 5 years of life. And so those routine well child visits can be a very good opportunity to inform parents about these kinds of approaches. So for example, Alan Mendelsohn at NYU has a long-running intervention known as the Video Interaction Project, where he provides parents with coaching in the context of the well child visit.
We have time for one more question, and
I'm interested in finding out, in terms of your goals, in other words, what's your long-term achievement? The other thing that struck me is that you talk about it takes a village to raise a child, and I'm not seeing, maybe it's there in terms of involvement of the empowering the community. Mm-hmm. Because what I think you are aiming at is really changing the environment. And within the home, that's not sufficient, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think your point is so important. And certainly when we talk about a child, we're talking about a child in a family, and that family sits within a larger community. And so the concentric circles keep building out. And so again, I think one of the things that we'd really like to achieve with Trauma Free NYC is being able to partner with communities and empower community members to inform us as well about what's important and what directions we should take as scientists. The ultimate goal, I think, is very broad, but I think an important goal, which is to find ways that science can help all individuals live healthy and satisfying lives, both physically healthy as well as mentally healthy, if we know that there are things in the environment that are interfering with those personal goals that people have.
Okay, so let me just take again this opportunity to thank our speakers, not only for their great presentations, but all the hard work behind them. And also to thank Pamela Smith and the Center for Science and Society for helping us put this on, as well as Ginny Rao for organizing this. And please, if you have other questions and you are afraid to get up and ask with a microphone in front of you, we're going to be adjourning to the area outside the auditorium for light refreshments. So feel free to come up and engage our speakers. And thank you, audience, for your terrific questions and your attention. Thank you.